September 10, 2017, Hurricane Irma made landfall on the Florida Keys as a Category 4. What the forecast didn't capture it had spent 60 consecutive hours as a Category 5 over open water. The storm surge hit Big Pine Key first. 15 feet of water. In under an hour, 90% of the homes on that island were gone. Not damaged. Gone. Irma hadn't even reached the Florida mainland yet. 134 people died. Most of them had been told to leave. The Florida Keys don't look like a disaster waiting to happen. From above, they look like a necklace, 1,100 small islands strung together along a thin strip of road for 113 miles into the Gulf of Mexico. The water on both sides is shallow and warm. It is, by almost every measure, paradise, and that is exactly the problem. The islands sit, on average, 6 feet above sea level. Most of them have no high ground, no hills, no ridge to retreat to when the water rises. There is one road in and one road out, US Highway 1, a 2-lane stretch that connects 75,000 residents to the Florida mainland. When that road floods, the Keys don't just get isolated, they disappear. In late August 2017, meteorologists were watching a tropical wave move off the west coast of Africa. Unremarkable at first. Dozens of waves like it form every season. Most fade over cooler water before they become anything dangerous. This one didn't fade. On August 30th, 2017, the wave organized into a tropical depression 120 miles southwest of the Cape Verde Islands. Within 6 hours, it was upgraded to Tropical Storm Irma. Within 24 hours, it was a Category 3 hurricane. The speed of intensification surprised even experienced meteorologists. By September 4th, Irma had grown a 29-mile wide eye, a perfectly formed, terrifyingly symmetric wall of destruction. The National Hurricane Center issued its first hurricane watches for the northern Leeward Islands. Then the second rapid intensification began. September 6th, early morning. Irma reached Category 5. Peak sustained winds, 180 miles per hour. Minimum central pressure, 914 millibars. The most powerful open Atlantic hurricane in recorded history. And then, it did something no storm in recorded Atlantic history had ever done. It stayed. Category 5. For 60 hours straight. The average Category 5 hurricane maintains that intensity for less than 24 hours before it weakens or makes land. Irma kept feeding on the warm open Atlantic, spinning at maximum intensity for 2.5 days. By the time it hit Barbuda on September 6th, meteorologists had stopped describing it in normal terms. 95% of the island's structures damaged or destroyed. In one morning. St. Martin followed hours later. 70% of homes demolished or severely damaged. Princess Juliana Airport, famous for planes flying, impossibly low over the beach, devastated. The airport beach, the planes, the hotels, all of it. And Irma still hadn't reached Florida. By September 7th, the National Hurricane Center issued its first hurricane watches for the continental United States. Florida Governor Rick Scott had already declared a state of emergency 3 days earlier. He activated 7,000 National Guard troops. He suspended tolls on Florida's major highways. He gave the order that would trigger the largest evacuation in American history. 6.5 million people were told to leave. The highways north out of Miami became parking lots. Fuel ran out at gas stations along I-95 and I-75. Families slept in their cars, waiting for the roads to move. Disney World began preparing to close for only the 5th time in its 45-year history. Some people left, and some people decided to stay. By September 8th, meteorologists had a new problem. Irma's track was shifting. For days, the models had shown the storm heading up Florida's east coast, hammering Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Palm Beach. Residents on the east coast had evacuated west. Residents on the west coast had evacuated east. The entire Florida peninsula was inside the cone of uncertainty. And then, the track moved west. West coast. Naples. Marco Island. The Florida Keys directly in the path. The people who had evacuated in the wrong direction were now caught. The people who had stayed in the Keys watching the track, thinking they were on the safe side, suddenly weren't. September 9th. Irma crossed Cuba. It weakened over land Category 2 as it tore across Cuba's northern coast, killing 10 people and destroying 158,000 homes. Cuba's storm surge exceeded 26 feet in some locations. But Cuba's coastline absorbed some of Irma's energy, and forecasters briefly hoped the storm was fading. They were wrong. Over the Straits of Florida, the warm, shallow water between Cuba and the Keys Irma re-intensified. By the morning of September 10th, it was a Category 4 again. 130 miles per hour, heading directly for the lower Keys. In the Keys, the mandatory evacuation order had been in effect for days. Most people had gone, The roads had cleared, but some had not left. Some residents had ridden out storms before. Some couldn't find transportation. Some refused to believe this one would be different. The last fuel trucks made their final runs at 4 a.m. By 7 a.m., US Highway 1 was empty in both directions. No cars moving north, no emergency vehicles moving south. The Keys had been sealed off. At 5 a.m. on September 10th, the autobahns began hitting Key West. Rain moving horizontally, trees bending at angles that seemed wrong. And then the wind. Not gusts, sustained. The kind of sustained wind that makes a building groan in a way it was never designed to make. The storm surge was already building offshore. 15 feet of Atlantic seawater, pushed by 130-mile-per-hour winds across the shallow ocean floor, gathering behind the storm like a wall. At 9 p.m. Eastern, Hurricane Irma made landfall at Cudjoe Key, the eyewall the most violent ring of the storm, where the wind is fastest and the rain is horizontal, and the pressure drops fast past directly over the lower keys. And behind the eyewall came the surge. Big Pine Key has no high ground. The island sits at sea level. When the storm surge arrived, it didn't rise slowly. It moved. Fast-moving seawater carrying debris refrigerators, cars, roof sections, boats that had been tied to their slips advancing through neighborhoods at the speed of a river in flood. First floors went in minutes. Then, the second floors. The families who had sheltered in their attics, who had thought a Category 4 downgrade from a Category 5 meant survivable, found themselves trapped between rising water below and the roof above. Some broke through their roofs with whatever they could find, hammers, bare hands. The storm sat over the Keys for 6 hours. 6 hours. At the same time Cudjoe Key was being destroyed, 120 miles north, Naples was watching Irma's western eyewall come ashore. Storm surge pushed through. Naples streets, 7 feet of water in neighborhoods that had never seen surge flooding. Fort Myers followed. Then the surge moved inland faster than anyone expected, submerging roads that were supposed to be evacuation routes. By 3:30 p.m., Irma made its second Florida landfall at Marco Island, still a Category 3, at 115 miles per hour. And then it kept going north. The Keys were dark. All communications had gone down during the eyewall passage. No phone signals, no emergency radio contact. The National Guard had pre-positioned resources at the top of the Keys, but US 1, the only road in, was underwater in at least 47 miles of its length. No one could get in. No one could get out. What was happening inside the Keys during those hours? No outside agency knew. Emergency managers at Monroe County's Operations Center relocated to the mainland before the storm could only watch the radar and wait. The Florida Keys were completely cut off from the rest of the world. On Big Pine Key, the storm surge reached 15 feet. The island averages 6 feet above sea level. That math is not complicated. 9 feet of water above the highest ground on the island. Cars were found miles from where they had been parked. Boats were deposited in the middle of residential streets. Homes' entire structures were moved off their foundations. The National Weather Service later confirmed what residents had feared. 90% of the homes on Big Pine Key were damaged or destroyed. 90%. In an American city, in 2017, an entire island was effectively erased. And here is the failure that made this possible, the one that had been visible for decades and never fixed. The Florida Keys are built on 6 feet of land surrounded by water. The building codes that governed construction in Monroe County allowed structures to be built at elevations that would be submerged by even a moderate storm surge. Engineers and emergency managers had known for years that a direct Category 4 hit on the lower Keys was not a question of if, it was when. The answer to that question was always, build anyway. 75,000 people. One road. Sea level. No elevation. That equation had been written into the landscape long before Irma formed. The federal response was also constrained before Irma arrived. Hurricane Harvey had struck Texas just 2 weeks earlier, still in active recovery, and FEMA resources were critically depleted. Help was coming. But the people trapped on Big Pine Key's rooftops didn't have days. They had hours. And the road was underwater. 200 miles north of the Keys, the storm was rewriting geography. Jacksonville inland, far from the coast, a city that doesn't think of itself as hurricane country, was flooding. The St. Johns River reversed its flow. Storm surge from the Atlantic pushed water upstream, backward through the mouth of the river. The river, which normally flows north into the Atlantic, moved south into the city. Historic downtown Jacksonville, Riverside, San Marco neighborhoods where people had stayed confident they were safe, found themselves wading through waist-deep water 40 miles from the nearest coastline. Irma was 300 miles past the Keys, still flooding cities it had never directly hit. 15 million Floridians lost power. Not 15,000. Not 150,000. 15 million. The largest power outage in Florida's history. The grid went down from the Keys to Gainesville to Jacksonville. The word that spread on social media before the cell towers went down was Armageddon. It wasn't wrong. The first helicopter reached the Keys on the morning of September 11th. What the pilots saw from the air was not a storm damage zone. Damage is not the right word for what had happened to Big Pine Key. It was foundations, concrete slabs where houses had been. Debris fields stretching from the ocean side of the island to the bay side. Boats in parking lots. Cars in the water. Streets no longer distinguishable from the ocean floor. Big Pine Key, from the air, looked like it had been scraped. Rescue teams couldn't land. The debris fields were too dense. They could see people on rooftops waving, climbing, trying to be visible, but reaching them required water access, and the water was filled with everything that had been above it the day before. The first boats reached the lower Keys on September 12th. What they found, people who had survived by going up. Attics, rooftops, the uppermost floors of the few two-story structures that held. Some had been there for over 24 hours. No clean water, no food, no way to signal for help. Waiting on a roof in September heat, surrounded by contaminated floodwater. Some did not survive the wait. The final US death toll reached 92 in the contiguous United States. Across the full path of the storm, Caribbean, Cuba, Florida, 134 people died. Every one of those 134 had made a decision in the days before September 10th. Stay or go. Some had no choice. No car, no money, no family to call. Some chose to stay because they'd done it before and survived. They were wrong this time. In the 700 emergency shelters opened across Florida housing 191,764 people, survivors watched the news, waiting for word about their homes. Some could not return to the Keys for weeks. Some of what they returned to was not recognizable. The Keys weren't just physically cut off. US 1 was damaged in dozens of places. Bridges needed inspection. Debris clearance alone took days. The National Guard ran supply convoys south as fast as the road could be cleared. But clearing the road was only part of the problem. There was almost nothing to go back to. The electricity grid in Monroe County was, in large sections, simply gone. Not damaged. Gone. Poles down. Lines in the water. Substations flooded. Restoration estimates for the lower Keys stretched to weeks. Without power, water treatment plants couldn't run. Without treated water, the Keys couldn't be repopulated. 1 month after Irma, there were still sections of the Florida Keys where residents were not allowed to return. Meanwhile, Florida's mainland began the long accounting of what the storm had cost. Hundreds of thousands of homes with roof damage. Entire neighborhoods that had never flooded before, flooded. The cost of Irma in Florida alone, $50 billion. The official review of Hurricane Irma's impact on the Florida Keys produced a conclusion that surprised almost no one who had been paying attention. The Keys were vulnerable by design. Monroe County's building codes and evacuation infrastructure had not been built around the assumption of a direct Category 4 hit. They had been built around optimism. The assumption that a storm this powerful would weaken before it arrived. That a slight track shift would spare the most vulnerable islands. That evacuation, if it came to that, would work. The evacuation did work for the people who left. The problem was that in a 113-mile island chain with one road out, the people who stayed or couldn't leave had no alternative. There was no hardened shelter on Big Pine Key capable of withstanding a 15-foot surge. No vertical evacuation structures the kind required in tsunami zones designed for the Keys' specific geography. The decision to build communities at sea level, on islands with no high ground and one exit, had been made long before the people living there arrived. They inherited the vulnerability. They just didn't know it until September 10, 2017. The power restoration timeline for Monroe County became a political flashpoint. Florida Power and Light restored power to most of the mainland within 2 weeks. Parts of the lower Keys waited 5 to 6 weeks. Every day without power was a day without water treatment, without businesses open, without residents able to return. Every closed business was money that wouldn't come back. Every family in a mainland hotel was a community that wasn't healing. Final damage total, $77.2 billion globally. 6th costliest tropical cyclone in recorded history. Most expensive hurricane ever to hit Florida. 134 people, not all at once. The count climbed for days after the storm. Some were found in the water, some in debris, some in their homes, where they had decided to shelter and the shelter had not held. Each number in that count came with a name the news would print once, and then move on from. In the months after Irma, Florida made changes. The shoulder use plan, the first ever activation of emergency lanes on I-75 and I-4 for evacuation, was declared a success. It was formalized into the state's future evacuation protocols. A procedural improvement. The kind of thing that doesn't make headlines but might, in a future storm, move 200,000 extra people out of danger before a road floods. Monroe County began reviewing its building codes. Conversations began about elevation requirements, vertical evacuation options, whether a 113-mile island chain with one road out should continue to be developed at the rate it had been. Those conversations are still happening. The Florida Keys rebuilt. Slowly, unevenly, expensively, but they rebuilt. Big Pine Key has homes again. Businesses reopened. The dive shops and the fishing charters and the places that serve key lime pie at tables 6 feet from the ocean came back. Some lots are still empty. Some families did not come back. And some did, and rebuilt in exactly the same place, at exactly the same elevation, on exactly the same island that Irma erased in under an hour. Because that is what people do. They build in paradise. They stay in paradise. And when the water comes, and the water does come, in the Florida Keys, it always comes, they rebuild again. Hurricane Irma made landfall on the Florida Keys 9 years ago. The storm surge maps for Monroe County have been updated. The evacuation protocols have been improved. The building code conversations continue. US Highway 1 is still the only road out. 75,000 people still live at sea level, and in the Atlantic, every August, the water warms. The Keys rebuilt. The water still comes. They stayed anyway.